detail, and then we're going to shift and go to Peter and Alex and talk about the pilot and the we can, if one is complete, we can obviously print it out. Okay, we're live. Welcome everyone to Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs. It is Tuesday, April 21st, and we are on a Tuesday addressing housing, and we're going to be looking at coming to resolution on H775 and H757. And one is our rural financing bill, which has a number of interesting opportunities for us to expand housing finance. And the other is a bill that deals with some technical corrections and improvements for our manufactured home world. So I believe our counselor Cameron Wood has a new bill or a new draft that he's going to just at least explain the changes that we can anticipate.
For the record, Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative Counsel. So 4775. If you all recall, we did a walkthrough. It's been a little while, but there are certain provisions in 775 that are very similar to what you all passed in S3 2018. And so what the House General and Housing Committee has done is taken those two bills and just combined them into one. And Madam Chair, you had asked me to begin the process of doing that here for you all as well. There's just a few outstanding questions that I have before I want to share that with you all. But ultimately, what I would be doing is incorporating those two bills together, because there's a lot of language that you all passed that wasn't in 775. And then there's some language in 775 that was not in your bill. So for example, if you remember, we talked about a few weeks ago, the special assessments and the ability to bond for those special assessments. And so that would be something that's in 775 that wasn't in your bill.
Right.
And so I haven't made any changes to those sections. There's a few pieces that
Michael Gahn came, talked about it for Bond Bank. It gives us another tool for our towns.
right. And so then there were a few pieces that were slightly different. So if you all remember, you made some changes in 328 about the municipal planning and requiring some changes in the housing element for a municipal plan. The 775 had a lot more language built into their version. Yours was a little more succinct and approved by the regional planning and VLCT, etc. In the House, they in their most recent version of their amendment to your bill, S328, they've decided to go with the language that you all went with. And so, whether their position changes at some point, I can't say, but as of right now, they're comfortable with the language that you all drafted. So I would incorporate that into an amendment for 775. So anyway, what I'm doing is I'm just merging the two bills. One piece that I think you may want to hear from
And let me just put a pin in that as to why. One of the bills is going to be the final bill that we go with. Depends on our timing of how quickly we can get this passed. And a lot of our housing bill got sent to House Natural. So there are quite a few pieces that got sent over to House Natural. So in some ways, the hope is that this bill that we're working on now will be the fuller housing bill, and that we will end up merging the two of them together. So as much as they're in sync, the better in terms of whatever we finally end up merging them with.
Great example. So there were some of those pieces, Madam Chair, as you mentioned, that currently have been stripped out of the House General Amendment to your bill to S328 because they're in House Environment. I've incorporated them into your amendment here. So they're back in, you passed them at 328, I put them back in here.
Oh, great.
One thing that you may want to hear from your witnesses this morning, if you're hearing from the commissioner and you're hearing from the treasurer's office, one of the primary differences between the bill as you passed 328 and the bill that came over 775 is in regards to the credit facility with the treasurer's office.
Right. We chose not to continue working on that and let the House finish their first, the initial work on it, and then we would then look at what they had.
Right. And so what you all did was you increased the cap from 10% to 12.5, but you did not include the 1% credit facility for offsite constructed housing. That was in the House bill. And here, I'm going to try to pull it up real quick just so I can point you to exactly where it's at in the bill.
And this, for everyone listening, let's remind ourselves, because we have the treasurer's office here to testify. This takes 1% of that 12.5% amount and dedicates it to modular and manufactured housing opportunities, the pilot, the 802 pilot, a couple of things.
So this is on page 2. So Vermont Housing Special Fund. So right here on line 19 is increasing the credit facility from 10 to 12.5%. You all have that in your bill in 328. But what the House did further, moving on to page 3 here, is they authorized a credit facility of up to 1%. And it may be used only to facilitate housing development through the bulk purchasing of offsite constructed housing and to aid in the purchase of offsite constructed housing units. So that was not in your bill, right? And then kind of corresponding with that, the House version has this offsite constructed accelerator pilot, which has ACCD working with BGS to work with municipalities to try to look at bulk purchasing, streamlining regulatory processes, offsite construction, statewide procurement consortium for bulk purchasing modular units, and trying to move a pilot project forward to examine how that could work. And so those, this is a difference in the two versions of the bill, and you may want to talk to your witnesses today to figure out which one you would be more comfortable with. Do you want to amend 775 to remove this, or do you want to make changes to it?
Right. And I think there are concerns both about sending money out of state on this issue and some of the risk involved. So I think that when we have the treasurer's office testify, we want to listen to the, address those concerns.
Right. That was one of the recommended edits that was discussed from one of your members who's not here, but about if you're going to have this 1% credit facility to allow the state's money to purchase offsite modular constructed housing, do you want to require that housing be primarily developed in Vermont? And if you want to go that direction, I probably want to work with the department to make sure the language is reflected accurately. This is offsite construction.
We're just talking about the credit facility. And offsite construction. So Alex is coming down and Peter are here.
So that may be a question you want to ask him is if we're going to set up this credit facility.
Right.
So this is one of the potential changes you would have requested or recommended. If you're going to have this credit facility and allow state monies to purchase offsite constructed housing, do you want to limit that to offsite constructed housing in Vermont? That's primarily assembled in Vermont or somehow built in Vermont. So that may be a question you want to ask the commissioner. So, but that's where I'm at, and I have a draft. I just need to put some final touches on it and have Chair speak with you about a few pieces that the House is also considering subsequent to this bill being passed, and I'll have that ready to go. But
Right.
For this
And
morning,
I think just from what I understand, given the pieces that have been taken out of our housing bill and sent to House Natural, because their jurisdictions are slightly different than ours, this may end up being the final vehicle for housing, given. But we're putting back some of our pieces.
Yes.
In return.
Okay, so we'd hold on to it to get the house natural work
Yeah,
to us.
I'm clear. Yes, I think that's all.
Or, I mean, whatever House Natural does, we put our work back in.
We put our back in.
Correct.
So I think that then the house is gonna have to figure that out. So, and then we can figure it out further in conference if we need to. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I've texted Alex to let him know we have started early. And that it would be great to have him. Thank you, Cam. And I think, so before we dive into sections 3 and 4, or 2, 3 and 4, I would love, I feel like we go from sections 2 to 4. There's no section 3.
Section 3, it's just says,
Where is section 3?
middle of page 4, line 13.
Oh, it's deleted. That's why I'm having trouble finding it. Great, Alex. Good to see you. And as we begin to sort of try and land some of these airplanes, other sections, I know these 2 sections are of great interest to us. And
What's the deleted thing?
I can't remember what section 3 was, but
Is this our bill?
no, this is H775. Yeah.
And they deleted,
What was section 3?
I'm trying to double check.
Okay, anyway, it came to us deleted. What can I tell you?
Could be
We'll
a
find out. I don't know. It's unusual to have it come to us as,
unless they
Was,
deleted existing statute.
anyway, we'll find out. But my question for you is, other than sections 2 and 4 at the moment, which we hope will renumber, what other sections in this bill do we need to address further? So I appreciate the credit facility is one we need to address, and the pilot.
Section 4 is key.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just dive in there and then we'll, I think would like Peter and Alex, you want to come up together and
Sure,
discuss this?
sure.
Because I think this work goes hand in glove. Pull your chair over. And, if you would talk to us both about the pilot and the credit facility, let's address them. We have concerns about risk.
Yep.
And putting state money at risk, and we have concerns about supporting in-state development and what an opportunity this is. So however you'd like to go, we're happy to, but you're pretty clear on our concerns, so.
Sure. I'll offer just sort of a blanket. As for the pilot, whether we want to layer on additional constraints or not, I caution us not to, because we don't know what it's going to take to sort of get someone interested in doing this right now. Obviously this credit facility gives us cash.
Just introduce yourself.
Oh, what's my name? Alex Farrell, Commissioner of the Department of Housing.
Such a dad.
Yeah, it's just
Who am I? Where am
I know.
I might.
Teething baby. So to say layer on an additional constraint, that has to be, say, a Vermont producer. That could be, factored into our criteria where it's, a preference that would be a Vermont producer, but I don't know what the pilot's going to look like. I don't know what kind of developer would be able to entice. So I keep it broader, just generally speaking, giving the treasurer's office, the credit facility more flexibility than us, department more flexibility to execute.
So then,
Sorry, just I want to clarify, the pilot, as I understand it, is primarily modular housing, is that correct? Because that is mostly an opportunity that exists in state already, in a facility that has a huge capacity for growth.
Well, that's what's envisioned, is modular. There's some discussion of a parallel but distinct effort to be undertaken by the Vermont State Housing Authority that may contemplate other things like
Right.
crosswalks, but that's not being contemplated as a part of
The
this.
VSHA piece, that we've heard about, that might include manufactured housing out of that piece of the pilot might be out of state.
Absolutely, and that'd be a totally distinct, that wouldn't necessarily be part of our pilot.
Oh, okay.
That lessons gleaned from it could be a part of a report back to the committee. But it'd be our intention really to focus on modular, and, pilot language in here still includes language that we had inserted regarding establishment of things like a statewide offsite code. So one code statewide that say municipalities couldn't modify. This would give producers the opportunity to know whether they're in the state of Vermont or outside the state of Vermont. Producers the opportunity to know they could produce and deliver units to Vermont, and not have to worry that they're going to end up, having to make small modifications to these units, or that it wouldn't comply, things like that. So those are reasons somebody would have a hard time scaling up in Vermont as it is. So the purpose of focusing on modular would be to give us those lessons learned. What are the potential pitfalls of producing modular at scale?
Right, thank you.
So you could take your feedback and go in a completely other direction, right? Which is, let's not be prescriptive about where we think we should carry the most risk right now. We just started CHIP. A lot of our housing policy work is just taking root. Do you believe that we need to spell out this pilot for you to be able to do good work to figure out where we're going to get low cost modular housing? Or can we do that without spelling out this pilot and just giving the credit facility?
As a general rule, I never feel that we need anything spelled out. 802 Homes is evidence that we undertook that on our own.
Right.
And the committee of the legislature ever wants to sort of give us
Broad.
cover.
Yeah.
Well, broad discretion.
Well, and require reporting back and, sort of some umbrella.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think that can be achieved, to the senator's point, giving us very broad discretion, giving
Right.
us a lot of leeway to figure out the best way to.
I kind of don't want to give this cover, because I do worry about right now how much discrimination there is against modular manufactured housing and citing things on less than an acre. And so you've sort of still given me my answer, which is, I don't know if this is the best use of risky dollars when we just started to implement a lot of other housing policy, that I just want housing to be built this year with this money.
If I may speak, Peter Trombley, Office of the State Treasurer, for the risk piece. I think when we had initially proposed, and this goes to your question of what was Section 3, when we had initially proposed this credit facility, we were looking to be able to take on a greater degree of risk, and to compensate for that risk, retain our interest on our other loans to repay the credit facility for losses. The
Okay.
greater amount of risk we could take on, the more cost savings we thought we might be able to deliver through the pilot. Now that that interest section has been removed, our office would, in funding this pilot, be looking to take on no greater risk than we do with any of our other loans, which is to say, work through an intermediary that guarantees the state 100% repayment.
But I guess like this being successful this year seems like not worth us writing in statute. You have to use some of the money at all for this.
Well, the way we would read this statute is that if we're establishing this sub-credit facility to fund this pilot program, that sub-credit facility funding would have to be used for offsite. But if we were to determine that the pilot,
Credit facility.
then 1%, we would think of
So
that.
this is still a set aside.
Well, if we were to feel that we could not fund the pilot either in the short term or at all with an adequate degree of risk protection, then we would not be required to set aside that funding. Definitely, we could deploy that funding towards our base credit.
But you can understand the disagreement with any set aside.
I
I
think
like, what does that get us?
my understanding is it's in May, right?
Yeah.
It's in May, so, right,
Yeah.
right. So they don't need to.
We would.
So we don't need this. That's what you're saying.
I
We
think
don't need the language. You could you may do it anyway.
I think it's perhaps arguable that the existing statute would let us do this anyway,
Yeah.
because from our end it would look all the same as our other loans. I
Right.
think when we had envisioned this greater degree of risk, the compensation from the interest, then in that moment it was necessary, and I think legislative blessing that's explicit in statute would be appreciated.
Blessing for a sub credit for 1% of the 12.5 assets.
Right.
1% within the 12.5, so 1% of the state's average cash balance. At our current calculations, we would consider that $12 million, up to 12.
So you want the legislature's blessing through this policy to give 12 million to a modular housing project that helps us develop a statewide code for modular, for.
I think we would be using up to $12 million to provide the way it would likely be structured, and the details of this would be worked out the crafting of the pilot with ACCD. The way we probably envision it being structured is us using our money through an intermediary to provide the short-term capital necessary to purchase homes as they are made available in the assembly schedule, so that they can then be redeployed through developers to individual
What
throughout the state.
What current parameters do you have on all the funds you authorize? In terms of the area median income percentage that the home is ultimately rented or sold for, unless you only do ownership?
We don't only do ownership, and we do, the majority of our investment portfolio is in affordable housing, lowercase a affordable. There's some
market rate.
There's some strictly affordable. There's some 80 to 20.
Some is capitally affordable.
Yes, some is
Yeah,
workforce housing, some is market rate. We're definitely leveraged into the affordable and workforce space more than market rate.
when you say market rate, meaning, do you keep it at a particular AMI?
There's a lot of housing developments in our portfolio are at a particular AMI, 60, 80, 100%.
Okay, they don't go above 100%.
Some go up to 120, and then some,
Okay.
there are some units. Most often what we see is a single development project will contain everything from market rate to affordable in order to make the project
Yeah.
finance. And
Yep, so mixed. And do you feel right now like you're getting into every county?
we are in 12 out of 14 counties.
Okay.
There are 2 counties from which we have never received an application, and
Okay.
which we would very much like to receive an application from if there's any housing
Give
development.
us a shout out. What you got?
Lamoille and Essex counties. Who would like
Lamoille?
to- Lamoille and Essex counties.
What's the
That's a shout out.
project in Orleans?
There is a project in Newport Town and a project in Newport Center.
Oh, great. So,
Are those single family homes or?
I believe they are multifamily buildings, but I would.
yeah, good double check. So this might be a good moment to hear from Jason Weber, who's Webster, I'm sorry. I'm thinking of grilling, the weather is bad. It's like a grill.
I did.
Jason, welcome back. It's good to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I hear you had a great tour last week with House General.
It's good to have him here.
As you can hear, we're in the process of discussing both the pilot and the credit facility because they go hand in glove, obviously. And but just appreciate your input on how this might be put to use fairly immediately with you and your Huntington Homes operation.
Yeah. So, well, thanks for having me. For the record, Jason Webster with Huntington Homes. And yeah, I mean, I kind of, starting with the problem is that we just don't see starter homes anymore, right? So when our company started in 1978 and through the 80s, we built primarily what we were building were starter homes, right? So there are bunches of neighborhoods in Waterbury and Montpelier and Berrytown and Northfield where we would go in and just build a whole neighborhood's worth of starter homes. I honestly can't tell you in the last 25 years, I can't tell you the last starter home we built. And so whether we like it or not, right, we kind of, as much as we like to think that we pitch, we drive the market, we pitch, we more we follow it. And all we've found, lately in the last 25 years, the only thing that we, and I think all builders are building, is the middle to the high end of the market. And we can talk about for various reasons of how we got there. And what I like about this program is that, where also is happening is that, even though we as an offsite manufacturing company have probably standardized more of our buildings than anybody else has, right? Each one is still a one-off individual unique house, right? So even regardless of the segment of the market, it still is a custom build, where each contract is built under its own construction contract with its own clients, its own set of challenges, its own negotiation, its own personalities. Everyone has a father-in-law that's involved, right? And so we were really not able to share we're not able to kind of get into cost efficiencies where we're aggregating multiple projects and then going back out to, our vendors or buying, equipment or scaling or anything, for more of a larger order of a standardized product. And so I like this concept as a way to, try to aggregate an order for a standardized product, right? So to make a distinction, and I think we know this, but to make a distinction, right? 100 individual orders for 100 houses is very, very different from a purchase order for 100 of the same houses, right? If we have 100 individual orders, it's very hard to kind of it's hard for us to go to FW Webb's or Granite Group and, have them quote out, 300 toilets because we don't have an order for 300 toilets. So I like this. We need, and we'd be more than happy to kind of, look at those purchase orders and the product to kind of build out a pack, build out a whole bunch of these standardized units. We have a large parking lot where we can even stage stuff here, right? We obviously have issues of cash flow, right? Like we can't just build them and then just sit on them. So, ultimately I think I think that for us to build a bunch of units in a credit facility for us to do it almost seems like the easier problem to solve. I think that the larger problem to solve is where the heck are these things going?
Thank you,
Like,
Jason.
like,
One of my favorite people.
like where,
That's
Yeah,
what
where are they
Alan is
going?
hoping to answer.
Somebody
Yeah.
needs to.
I think the question is, but you're not gonna build them until you know that there's a place for them to go.
well, I mean, so in our historic model, that's correct, right? In the historic model, we have 100 houses has 100 unique clients. And so they already have, maybe some of them are small developers and they've already subdivided and they're working with us to provide units to their little development. Maybe they're, one-off on your lot clients that are coming in here and we're building for. And so that's what I'm saying. Each one of them is unique and there isn't really cost efficiencies that we can kind of share between those things. And when I think back about, what we used to build when we built starter homes in the 80s, those were whole neighborhoods, right? They were whole neighborhoods that
Right, so the
had
cost efficiency, and the cost efficiency made sense.
correct.
But my understanding is the pilot, once the pilot is up and running, you will only be building those modular units once you have an order from a town that says, okay, we've chosen model 3 or whatever they've chosen, or they've chosen a whole bunch, and that those would be built only after they've been identified where they were going.
How would the town choose models? Like,
This is the interplay between the pilot and this proposal. So it's good to
Yeah.
have 3 of you here. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, ideally that is, how it would work. But at that point, I think I think about a recent project we did that actually worked really well. And maybe I'm just coming at it, looking at the same thing from a different angle, right? I think about a project we're just finishing in West Lebanon, which was 22 single family units. There were 3 building types that went into that development. And what made that project successful was that it was financed in one batch, right? So it was, and so there was, and that was backed by Dartmouth.
Right.
And so what that allowed us to do, is once the building types were figured out and the site was permitted, there were some efficiencies of the entire building team to essentially run through the project as fast as we could, right? So site work, everything gets installed, right? The full road gets installed, all the infrastructure is brought in, the sidewalks were built, the foundations were put in the ground at one time, right? So that was a general contractor being, you know, leveraging scale to get
Yeah.
contractors to build their pricing. And then we just essentially went all the way around the neighborhood, just in a timing sequence, dropping almost the same house over and over and over and over and over again. And because I knew what that was and we were able to share engineering, there was definitely cost savings that went, you know, to that project. Because I knew I was going to build, I knew in one purchase order, there were
Right.
22 houses to build.
Yeah.
Versus the way that we see a lot of other development going, and I won't name names, but it's another project we're working on right now where that one is tied, even though there's funding, I think, that's been committed to the whole project, the project is still very much on the construction side in limbo tied to pre-sales. And so there's a lot of like design changes that are happening mid-project.
That's
Not
tough.
all units have been committed yet. And so I'm not as inclined to push as deep of cost savings to a project that isn't committed in one batch.
No, I appreciate, and just, Thomas has a question, I know also, but I just hope that Alex, I respond to this, because I think my understanding pilot is that that's exactly what you're hoping in a different way, but hoping to have towns commit to, that you would be doing exactly sort of something similar to what
Do
you're
just before we move on, I want to know what the listing price was for the West Lebanon home.
Well, so the West Leb is not that they got some real pushback on that. That went into that was not what anybody would consider workforce or affordable housing, right? That went into Dartmouth's rental pool. And so what Dartmouth did is they essentially funded a private developer to build out the project, and then Dartmouth at the end agreed to buy the units and bring them into their rental pool for, you know, faculty and graduate students. And they were not, you know, I think they're renting for over $4,000 a month, right? That was not
a whole house. Wow.
Yeah.
That's good. And did you negotiate a price per house with Dartmouth? What do you know what the price was?
Yeah, I mean, my involvement as the manufacturer in that project was just as manufacturing and providing the module components for it.
But
Yeah,
did you?
and so when I bid that project, there were certainly discounts that I was bidding because I knew I was probably up against other manufacturers. And I wanted 22 houses worth of work. And so we were pretty aggressive in how we bid that project.
So, but you don't know the final purchase that.
I don't know what the final is. That was the owner.
Alex, how does the 802 Homes pilot fit into that kind of cost efficiency in terms of?
Well, let me create a couple distinct things here. So first, let's just talk about the pilot, because Jason raised the question that is the entire point of having a pilot, which is where. And that's the point of the pilot, is we would identify a parcel, then a developer would come in with a master plan for that parcel so that Jason would know what an entire order is. A town's role could be, maybe, if they own the land, a town's role could be that they own the land and they're donating or contributing the land to the cost. Town's role could be that they're okay with the state utilizing lands from state-owned lands inventory at a reasonable cost. That's the town's role. A developer would come in and place a master order to Jason and for fairness to Jason, there's no reason he'd be aware of this pilot language. So that would be the only point of having a pilot. And that pilot can only work with capital. So as some might recall, there was contemplation of could there be a pilot with, say, a slug of money that would be the incentive to make this happen. You need a reason for a developer to come and do it this way with this delivery model rather than on site. Once that is established, then we can do the other things like, all right, pick from a catalog of designs, either that the producer of that developer's choice has, or perhaps it's from the 802 Homes catalog, but it needs to be more flexible so that the developer and whoever the producer is, like Huntington Homes, could decide what is the slate of units in this order. So it's one bulk order placed in this project.
Okay, Thomas.
So this credit facility would be used exclusively by the Jason Huntington Homes out there, it's not by the developer, and they would only engage in this credit facility using this risk subsidization when they have a contract in hand with a developer that's already worked through all the permitting with the town and so on. Is that correct?
I defer to the treasurer's office. I would envision it being the other way, that the developer would access it, but then the Huntington Homes is, sorry, Jason, to keep using you as the example here, there's now that slug of capital that the developer can offer, and that gives Jason the assurance that, okay, I can go ahead and produce these 35 units because this developer has this guaranteed capital.
Look, you're the answer.
And I think that's the most important part right there. I'm not, when a product going through our assembly line, right? 2x6s are 2x6s, right? Like we can, I don't think that whether it's one of our pre-designs or whether it's the 802 Home Designs, whether, it's a 20 unit project that has 8 different building designs, that doesn't matter to us as much as the commitment to the project does, right? So that the financial commitment to the project, to know that when we start it, we're going to finish it. And that's just not the way most developments currently work, right? Most developers, bless them, they just shed risk, right? They're trying to take the least amount of risk as they can. And so they're not committing to an entire project up front because they have financial obligations, right? Their deck behind them that they have to satisfy. They have benchmarks that they have to satisfy. And so they're not just releasing all the contractors at once to build, to come in and bang the thing out. There's a lot of us kind of like it's false starts, right? Where we think we have it and then we don't have it. And then we get asked to like stand on our heads and come back. Having a project fully committed is the most important thing.
Right. Well, we have one of those developers in Killington who would conceivably have that kind of capital investment ready with a slug, ready to do at least a portion of them all.
They're getting stopped by the land use for people to try to capture. And
that's a different issue. The where.
It's not.
So we begin with the where. I mean, for example, the Windsor prison site, the former prison site.
But in
Where?
defense of the developers,
Yeah.
it's not that they don't want to do these things. It's that they get stuck with appeals and local permits and all these other things that stall things out. So my fear is as they shed risk, they're shedding that risk to their treasury. And that's where I'm worried that we're going to take on risk sitting on homes or contracts or lending these facilities out. Development projects go sideways.
Without just
Look at
getting the
Pitt
risk
in
out of the way.
Burlington. Yeah,
Right.
the Pitt in Burlington, other times. So I just don't know why the state is venturing into subsidizing this higher degree of risk without having more confident reform to our regulatory landscape, making it easier to build in areas that we should be building that I just don't see us having done this biennium. So that's why I'm pausing on this, because I just don't know if this is the right use of our risk.
Right.
So-
Yeah. I think the question is, yeah.
If we were doing more on Act 250 reform this session, I'd probably be more supportive of this. But since I haven't seen that, I anticipate these developments going sideways, and that's going to leave the state coffers holding on to these notes for houses that aren't going to get developed because developers have shedded that risk onto us.
And municipal reform, to be fair, because
Correct.
the two projects I can envision that would be good case studies for this are Montgomery and Orleans. 2 case studies where they've come into committee and, wanted to build 30 single family homes essentially. And in Montgomery, it was Act 250 that has stopped that, even though they have a huge wastewater bond that they work to approve for exactly this reason. And Orleans, where the municipality doesn't have to follow our municipal changes because they don't have zoning and land use bylaws or something, they said, we want half-acre plots instead of quarter-acre plots, essentially, killed that project. You tell me where this would happen, like say the name of the town out loud, so we can bring that town in and make sure it's going to happen. Otherwise, it's going to take 2 years to even identify a site that will work. And I'm not ready to say this is the best use of our money when I just want housing built right now. And Jason could speak to Arby's. Like, I love to pilot something that says to us, how do we get all of the risk out of the way? But for this project, we could say, you can't go through, you're exempt from the permit process.
No, I
But
appreciate
that
that.
would be an interesting pilot. How do we build it cheaply when we don't have 3 layers of regulatory processes in the way? I'd love to know that answer. But I don't need to know how hard this would be to make it affordable. I know that.
We already know.
Why don't I address
Alex,
it to you?
answer this about this pilot.
Senator, thank you for mentioning that. We probably still have a long way to go on Act 250. Obviously encouraging signs in S 325. We get to see what that'll look like at the end of the session, but components of that as proposed by the RPC do alleviate things like the kill and tipping divorcing this national register historic eligibility from land use limiting. That's nonsensical, right? So S 325 achieves that in part. So it would make 1A and 1B areas more attainable for more areas 19 a little bit larger. So that's one piece. Do I think that's not far enough? No, you're never going to hear me say that is is quite right, because I think it's so nuanced. We've got so far to go, but it's heading in the right direction. I'd say on a related note, if there's concern over, is this the right time? Is this the right use? The combination of the May in the credit facility and pushing out any dates in the pilot to say, this doesn't have to happen right now. If say there were 26 acres in St. Albans town that were included in the interim exemption and that were a willing property owner, and we could move right now because it is incorporated in the interim exemption, I'd say that would be the right parcel. I don't know that property owner's name or share would be interested in moving forward right now. So if we push the date out, and again, I'm just giving you thoughts to consider. If we push the date out, then as we see where things like S 325 and further legislation next session go to alleviate some of these constraints, then we're not forcing the Treasurer's Office or my department to act on something before we know that there's some regulatory certainty. On Arby's, good news that Elkhart did choose not to unwind what was done as a result of the executive
Thank you,
order
David.
and the rulemaking that followed. So there's now some relief to Arby's avoiding some of that. So yeah, I think making these flexible sort of may use 1%. The pilot can go forward. I think adding language, if an appropriate site is identified and if regulatory constraints are not a concern, and pushing out dates. I share the concerns. Let's not force something to happen if it doesn't make sense to happen right now. And the sense I get is Jason would say the same thing. What we want to do is see if we can demonstrate a model that could be a new delivery system going forward. We don't want to force something that's going to be inefficient.
Right. I'm not going to die on the hill of the May. Like, I'm not necessarily blessing this, not because of the lack of compelling testimony, but because the legislature itself is on the one hand saying, here's money to do something, and on the other hand, making it very risky and expensive. So you're the messengers for a larger problem that we have, where we keep driving up the cost per unit and then saying we want all these wonderful things to happen. I want you, Jason, to be able to do all the wonderful things. I want us to listen to you when you say it got more expensive for this reason, it got delayed a year for this reason, etc. And I want you to bring that back to us, because that's the problem. But you figuring out that you can buy widgets and bulk for cheaper, great. I think Jason made this point too. Us identifying that we have a real problem with discrimination against creating a newly developed neighborhood that's affordable for people is the information that would be valuable to gather if we're going to do this.
But in all fairness, I think that's part of what the pilot is about, is identifying the wheres, working with, is that correct? I mean,
It has to be, I mean.
Well, obviously. So the wheres already, Alex, I believe, is working with our building and general services to identify state lands where this might be appropriate. I think you're working on the wheres, and there's no green light on using the credit facility until you have the agreement with the developer and the town and the where. Is that, that's my understanding, but
Yeah, that's all correct. And I wouldn't be so prescriptive as to choose any single course of identifying a site. If it happens to be something that's owned by BGS right now, we can go that route, great.
well, that's one option.
That's right. Senator, I'm just to hear your point, which is, do we want to do a project, fund a project, and then come back and say, here are all the regulatory constraints that drove up the cost or made it harder to deliver?
We don't-
Look, I'd
yeah,
be
we don't
wide
want that.
open to the legislature granting some blanket waiver
Yes.
of certain regulations for the sake of this
Yeah,
pilot.
I'd like to see how inexpensive it can be if it actually just happens, as Jason said, because if it is presumed to meet all our existing exemptions, period, the end. It's a permitted use, whatever we need to say, that it does happen quickly.
I think that's, I really like that framing, Senator. I mean, one way to approach this is we could go about it, right? Utilizing what clear exemptions from permitting did we get out of the Home Act, what clear exemptions we know as a result of the interims for the longer term, 1A and 1B, and design something to fit those. But
Or any other exemptions that, I mean, I really think
Yeah.
it's like,
We have
the question for me is, why aren't the laws we passed working to build new neighborhoods? And if we pass CHIP, the goal of CHIP is to build literally new neighborhoods.
Right.
Period.
who have
And
in your neighborhood.
If something that we tried to accomplish in 3 bills, municipal reform, Act 250 reform, and infrastructure investment. If that isn't enough to get something built, plus this credit facility, then that is us getting in our own way. And we should make it clear in the language that nothing else can come in and get in our way if those criteria are met.
Well, I think that
I just want to build a neighborhood.
Yes,
Please, let's
yeah,
make
I
it
mean,
Nathan, like God knows.
right.
I think the
Your
financing piece of where the money is coming from is a major problem for developers, right? So I have a meeting this afternoon with somebody that has a very large community block grant already awarded to them, but they still need to go. I haven't caught up on the entirety of the details yet because I haven't met with them yet. It's this afternoon. It's 28 units of housing for Montpelier. And I think that developer is going to disappear for months, not because of permits, because there are towns we are starting to find that are actually, Morrisville's been doing this for years, right? Where you walk in and they're basically like they're a guide service to say, how do we get you through our permitting process as fast as possible? We desperately want and need new housing. I'm starting to see it in other towns, right? The towns themselves are reaching out. Montpelier is one of them. I think this developer is going to disappear for months as they go try to figure out their financing, because the conventional financing isn't, there's another whole level of group out there that's just, right? You think you're trying to shed risk, they try to shed more, right? So it's not going to happen because they don't have the money behind it.
For the permits, but I think I know who you're talking about, and I think we've had them testify before, and it would be really great to check in, because one of the barriers, if this is the same project or a different 28 unit proposal of Montpelier, one of the barriers they were facing is they wanted to use all the financing available to them to build the infrastructure for 28 units, even if they only had approval for under 10 at the start. But they were told that Act 250 people might frown upon them trying to build infrastructure for more units without the full approval for those number of units. I do want to make sure they are slated to be able to build 28 units per our last 3 bills. And I want a case study that we think is going to be built and really test, because I've heard this morning they were in court. And I just want this project to get, if we don't look at the case studies of where things get stuck, then I end up feeling like, a Cassandra here,
Right,
just saying like every single one of these projects is stuck for years.
right.
Yeah.
And we're not getting them unstuck through policy. And I need us to do that while we commit dollars.
If I may briefly speak to the level of risk that the state would be taking on in this pilot, we'd be looking to undergo the same risk protections we do for any of our lag loans, which is to have an intermediary handle our financing. So we would envision us providing the capital through an intermediary.
So which intermediaries?
So we would have to have, find a willing intermediary in the construction of the pilot. And I mean, the idea is that there's an aggregated list of orders from individual developers that are bundled by said intermediary. That order is placed, and our capital is used by that intermediary to make sure that the homes are purchased as they're being made available by the producer of the homes, and holding them until such time as the developers finish signing them and sell them to the final consumer or the final consumer. And that if there is, so I think we would be looking for there to be sites and orders worked out as part of that order aggregation process. If there is a delay, someone needs to take on that risk. We would not do that as the state's role. We would do that as the intermediary's role, the order bundler's role. And they would be marking up our money in compensation for that as all of our.
I think what you're missing is just that we're trying to get that risk minimized, because it's still state money going to something that is a risk we created.
Absolutely. But from the state's risk perspective, we would be guaranteed repayment, just as we were guaranteed repayment for any lag loan.
Right, there are two distinct things here. There's concern for the state's investment, and I think Peter's speaking to that. And then there's sort of delivery of units, which is what.
And the cost to the consumer, who is a Vermonter, we hope.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that the more, like, somebody carries the risk, and usually it's the end consumer, or the project doesn't happen. And that's where we're not getting, we've talked about a density algorithm. We've talked about ways to say our permits cannot drive up the cost per unit and then be impugned, like, for, with.
Right. And I think for that reason, it's good to have those concerns distinct. If there's more concern about the state's investment and recouping that investment, that is a
Yeah, that's not a concern.
that is a concern that is valid and can be considered by the Treasurer's Office. If it's a concern for just broadly the delivery of units,
Yes.
At an affordable.
then then that's a separate conversation about our regulatory systems. I don't think anyone would promise that the switch to modular or the use of modular would alleviate regulatory barriers. It's really trying to establish whether or not this different delivery system in a state like Vermont. I mean, we're trying to learn from Scandinavian countries, Canada, Japan, who they haven't delivered modular at a lower cost per unit. That's really not what's being promised here. It's that with a short construction season can be reduced in time with delivery of units. And does that bear out in fund at what scale? So that's really what's being sort of investigated here.
Delivering more units in a timely way.
Well, but I think
That's relevant.
I think you're getting to another concern that Jason has raised for years, which is if we try to make our manufactured housing perform energy wise, et cetera, at like the highest net zero level of a stick built or what, then we know the second we do that, we're increasing the cost per unit by tens of thousands of dollars. So if this pilot is also going to tell us, these are the building code changes,
Well,
then, I mean, why I'm being so, stuck on this is because those of us who are here next year, I just hope we listen. If like, I'd love to move forward with this and learn really hard lessons that are shared
Yes.
between the natural resources and the economic committees about how much more expensive we're making housing the same time we're trying to say we need to make it more affordable.
Well,
Well-
and I appreciate that for sure. I think that something that's been, and I say this, insert foot straight in mouth. I think one of the things that has been kind of an issue with all of the, big A or little a affordable housing projects are the number of seats at the table. And that every single seat, every single interest adds costs, right? And so we have some of the most expensive, affordable housing projects, workforce housing projects in the Northeast because we try to solve every problem other than affordable housing with our new construction. And that at some point, if the goal is affordable housing, the decision tree needs to put affordable housing at the top. Every single thing that's underneath that doesn't deliver affordable housing says no. And we next, no, next. And if you go back and just visually, if you look at these developments that we were building in the 80s, that is exactly what they are, right? These are single family homes, not multifamily, which this is a whole nother discussion about what do people want, what should we be building kind of things, right? Developers went to multifamily because that's what started making financial sense. No third grader, when you ask them what their ideal house is drawing a picture of a 4-unit building, right? It's a little teeny house with a smokestack in the sun and a crow flying by, right? And so if you go back and you look at these projects that were built in the 80s all over the place in central Vermont, it's what I'm most familiar with. These were all developments where everything was done because it was the least expensive way to build houses, right? You go back like split entry houses that we built by the thousands in that time period. There was never a design award for a split entry house, right? That was not an architectural gem where somebody was like, this is the most beautiful thing we could ever build, right? That was builders allowing to and chasing the most cost-effective thing that they could possibly build. And then we built thousands of them. And so I love the idea of a pilot project, and I do agree that it's bigger than the pilot program of saying we need to minimize the seats at the table, right? That if this is not about affordable housing, it's not going to be part of this project. I also, in terms of the risk, I can't imagine building this until it had permits, right? And so now
I can't imagine loaning the money until it had.
yeah, like I can't imagine building anything until it had the permits. And so now it's about find a partner town. There are plenty of them out there that are like, would you build me a neighborhood of 1,400 square foot houses, affordable? Absolutely. They support it. Let it get its permits, remove the seats at the table and make it driven to affordable construction only, and then finance the whole thing and let it get built.
So just give it an Act 250 exemption, basically. Give it an Act 250 exempt so that if that's just not a question we have going into it. And we do know there are municipalities who would get their own.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Act 250 exemption. I think the bigger thing is remove the ability of neighbors that shouldn't have an opinion to have an opinion.
That's Act 250 appeals. I mean,
Yeah.
let me know as we write it.
Could be.
But
By right, right? By right.
permitted. Apparently we're supposed to say permitted because by right still gets us in court.
So I have two questions here. One is you've alluded to discussing and taking up a statewide building code. To go to Jason's point and what Keisha just said, we have had for the last 2 years an energy code, which looks like it's only going to add more cost. So I don't see the language in here about a statewide code. I think one of the things the pilot could be exploring as you look, it is actually coming back to the legislature with conceivably a statewide code that would keep housing affordable. I mean, to address all the things we've just been talking about. The question I have for you is, if we proceed with this pilot, what is the time frame? If it's not 2030, what is it? How many years do you need to make this happen, do you think? Or at least have enough information to come back to us and say, these are the hurdles that we got in the way. These are what we still have to solve. This is the statewide code that we probably need to enact to make this happen or to make it more affordable. What are,
Well, I think there are two things. There's a date that deals with the delivery of a report, right? I mean, we can deliver a report at almost any time, even if the
Yeah.
project is complete, and that could happen. Lessons learned that Senator Rosensell has spoken to. That could really happen at any point. Say,
but the demonstration project is at 30 and you have
Right.
a report on the in 28.
sure, and so 2030 may be reasonable. We wouldn't. Let's say you push the date out to 2035. We wouldn't delay the delivery of a project just because we've been given extra years.
Yeah.
But it would prevent us from having to keep coming back and saying, can we vote that date out? So I'd say an additional number of years is welcome because development's complicated. 2030 is reasonable for now, but
How close are you to having a town that would be ready to go?
we haven't necessarily
To go to the where piece.
Sure, we haven't necessarily explored a demonstration project to check the box of full modular neighborhood at this point. But to give you a sense, sort of a parallel but distinct effort is 802 homes. We already have at least one municipality in which we're sort of tangibly taking steps towards advancing a demonstration project where there's a developer that is eager to proceed utilizing 802 homes designs and a municipality that's on board ready to advance that project. So in that case, we're not even bringing capital to the deal. What we have is a developer who's just interested in advancing some of these initiatives with Vermont. You can't always count on that. So in this case, where we do have capital to bring to a deal, it's more likely that within a year or two, you could have an interested developer. And then development takes a while, right? 2 or 3 years. I'm sure if the treasurer's office were able to bring capital to bear, if we were given authority to advance this, even maybe as Senator Ron Hinsdale says, with certain preemptions of local or state permitting, we could likely come back next session to talk to you about possible developments.
Who advances the conversation about the statewide building code, which would make it simpler and less expensive, hopefully?
Well, it would likely be.
I don't think so. Right now there is no less expensive building code than what we currently have, which is none. Right. So Vermont, there is no building for single family residential. There is currently no building code in Vermont for single family residential. All we have is what nationally is a bolt-on energy code that the bolt-on is supposed to bolt onto building codes, and that's the way that every other state operates. The administration sits in their building code program, and then energy, plumbing, electrical is all a component of the larger scaffolding. Vermont in 1997 decided to go down its own path of, well, let's have a standalone energy code, which here we are, however many years later, and we're, just doesn't work. It's just not the way that it works. So I don't think that I wouldn't use the word code necessarily for what we're trying to develop. More, it would be a specification, right? So like, what is the specification for the homes that are going to be built under this program? Because to stand up a true code is an enormous project, right? It is a dedicated agency
Jason, I appreciate that, but I also know and have heard, and we have heard this constantly, is that until we do a statewide code and then even a regional code, that we will never be able to build enough offsite to really make it much less expensive. And that we need those pieces in place in many ways to make this happen.
Well, or if we adopt a code that is a base standard, but then don't layer everything else on
Right,
top of it,
exactly.
bolt on.
Well, and I
Well,
think
again, like when I think of like, because we certainly build in other states where we have to build under codes, right? Where there's energy codes. And I wouldn't say that the code is actually, it's establishing the minimum baseline of safety. It's right. The codes come out of the police protections, you know, and you're creating a minimum line of safety. I think not necessarily a standard. And so codes are, you know, they're doing things like counting nail spacing to make sure that, you know, that sheathing was installed and you have the proper shear structure of a panel. Layering that on right now when we currently have none is going to go the other direction. So I would never look at establishing a building code in Vermont as a way to lower pricing. Because it's probably not going to. I think that what the conversations in me with my other hat on for the Home Builders Association and why we've been advocating for codes is that I don't think it's going to make building less expensive, but what codes are going to do is they're going to make it safer looking forward, right? Like Vermonters, we've been lucky to date that we live in a small state, and you know, my grandmother probably knows your grandmother. And if we as a builder did something, then Graham's going to come and be real mad at us, right? And I think as we look, and so builders kind of had their own. There was an honesty to our construction because we didn't want your grandmother to be mad. I think that as we look forward and we are losing that, that I think it's going to be important to create a baseline of construction so that Vermonters don't get taken advantage of by some contractors.
Right. So that's our other hat is consumer protection. So we want a specific standard to which to build to, obviously.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think, and after this, if I may be excused, I do have to get to another engagement.
Yeah.
But I think Jason pointed something interesting. That's a good distinction, and what would likely come out of us a report on this is maybe a good clarification is what we would be seeking to establish is I'll put it as bluntly as sort of reducing municipal discretion. So establishing certain standards that municipalities can't alter, or reducing municipal discretion to alter certain, whether it's standards or you know, the energy standards or any other standards, so that say wetlands is another. Can you think of any municipalities?
Wetlands,
Well, I could, you know, example, Alec, example, you know, Heinsberg, right? I'll pick on them for a little bit. Heinsberg requires that all new construction be set up for, you know, you already wire for an electric car charger in all new construction, regardless of that, whether or not that that buyer has any intention of ever buying an electric car, right? There's a $600, you know, prep for a car charger that has to go on to every single house. And this would be, don't require those.
So given that Alex has to leave, Peter looks like he is ready to leave. What might we add I think we need to consider what we might add to the pilot to make it work for all of us. And have you answered the risk concerns you have, Thomas?
Yeah,
I think they have a little bit for me.
I worry that if I'm lucky enough to continue to serve in this role 5 years from now, I'm going to regret allowing for this if we're sitting on a lot of lost revenue from defaulted development of sitting on houses. But I'm comfortable enough with trusting in the testimony that you guys have said so far that there's enough safeguards for it. So I don't need to be an obstacle for this. I think some infill point possibly limit this to Vermont building makes a lot of sense. I hate for us to subsidize New Hampshire homes.
Peter and Alex, last parting thoughts, Jason, and then we're gonna turn to another bill.
We're happy to keep engaging offline.
Okay, great,
It's the same.
great.
Thank you.
Jason,
you.
thank you very much. Really, this was very
Thanks,
helpful.
Jason.
Good to have
Of course.
all of you in the same room, talking about the same thing at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work.
Yes, thank you for yours.
All right, bye.
Very grateful.
I only spoke to I've squawking against you. Do you have concerns?
Yes.
Okay.
Listening.
Did you have a question? I'm sorry.
Oh, I get it. I'm not in favor of the section.
Oh, you're not in favor of the credit facility at all?
We'll talk about that, but the pilot project, well, it's like I'm sure. Heavy concern.
Okay, well, let us see if we can address them in the next little bit. Great, I think,
Okay,
great. Jason, thank you
Bye.
very much.
thank you.
The offsite construction long term,
So I read a lengthy article over the weekend about Levittown,
yeah, you said that you had,
and it's just so applicable to what we're talking about here.
what,
I'll bring it.
yeah, that would be great. Or email us the link to it, or the, where was the article?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, great, that would be helpful. That'd be great. Cameron, let us shift to a bill that I think we're maybe ready to be close to voting out. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what additional work we wanted to do on 757. I think most of us are pretty supportive of the efforts in this bill. And Cameron, I just thought it would be good if we haven't talked about if we addressed any concerns people have. None of you raised any concerns with it, and I'm just thinking that maybe we could get this bill out and did it I'd love to just sort of walk through it again. We haven't talked about it for quite a while.
Just be happy to walk through the bill one more time. So for the record, Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative.
We rather use the time to talk about specific concerns as opposed to just blanket.
well, both. I'd just love to have you sort of walk through with a summary view of what, it's only 12 pages long, just to do a sort of summary on what it does and what the sections do, and then let's just chat about it, because I think that would be great.
Yeah, happy to. Okay, so this is 757 as it passed the House.
Right.
The first.
Well, we have not yet had
section-
any proposals for any changes, so and that's all we have, that's what passed.
So section 1, which is going to be from pages 1 all the way through about half of page 6, make very minor technical changes to the statute governing the transfer of ownership of, quote, a mobile home. And currently the definition, when you look at both Title 10, which governs mobile home parks, and then Title 9, Chapter 72, which governs the transfer of ownership of a mobile home, that's the phrase that's used, mobile.
That's right.
However, at the federal level, these are defined as manufactured homes. After the federal government came in the mid-70s and put in place regulations on the building of these types of homes, they are at the federal level called manufactured homes, and they have a specific definition. That definition exists in Title 10. And so what this first section does, it goes through the chapter related to selling of those homes.
Right.
And makes very kind of small, lowercase s substantive changes. So for example, on the definition of permanently sited, it states that here on line 3, page 2, factors that show a mobile home is permanently sited include one or more of the following to indicate that not all of them are required. Then you get into the next section, section 2604, which is about when you're going to sell a mobile home and it's being financed as real estate, it has to be transferred via a deed. And so there are some small, additions to the language here. So in the
So
sub,
it's then being transferred, it's becoming real property as opposed to how it was bought as personal property.
right, so just to take a step back,
I'm just reading this thing though, and the first thing I hit is what permanently cited means. And one or more following, having real difficulty to understand how that becomes permanently cited. Because these are characteristics of how mobile homes are often installed in mobile home parks. Set up on blocks, so the wheels don't forward, but wheels typically are still on the mobile home, even though it's up on blocks.
right?
Uh,
So just to take a quick step back and talk about these things in general. If an individual purchases a manufactured home, you can purchase it either from a dealer, which, would be a new home, or you can purchase it from an individual who owns one and they're selling it to you. Unlike typical situation where you're buying a stick-built home, where you're buying the property that goes underneath that house, you can move these things. Now,
Less than 1%, your testimony that less than 1% are ever moved.
and that's what I was about to say. I understand that there is some pushback when I make these comments from other members of this body and from the, external stakeholders. I'm not saying that they do move. I think in most instances, they probably don't. I'm saying that they can.
Right.
And I also understand, it's been pointed out to me, people will say, yeah, we also move stick-built homes too.
Right.
Yes.
But equally
Significantly less number,
Right.
percentage of the time.
Mhm.
Your statutory framework is set up to recognize the fact that these homes can move, and they do. And that's why you actually have in this chapter, you have sections that talk about if you're going to move the mobile home and you're selling it via a bill of sale, what you have to do, you have to get sign off from the town clerk on the bill of sale. You then have to transfer it to the new municipality where you're moving it to, file it with that town clerk. So the statutory framework is set up to recognize the fact that you can move them. And so historically, they have been movable. And so, that's what I was saying. You buy it from a dealer. And then the dealer is going to give you either a bill of sale or a deed. And it's dependent on how you're financing it.
Right.
And then how you're financing it, the lender is going to look at whether you own the land where the house is going, whether you lease it. And then they're also going to look at whether it is permanently sited. And so I'm just trying to pull up the statutory chapter real quick. Give me 1 second.
So what
So
we're looking at here on page 2 are the factors that identify that it has been permanently cited. It has, and it has all these things, which means it's not intended to move.
Right.
And so when it's sold, it hopefully with this bill will be able to be sold as real property, which means it'll have a mortgage. It'll be much less expensive to borrow that money and make it more affordable for people. We're also keeping the avenue open if they want to do it as a personal property sale, that they can. It will be more expensive for them up front, but perhaps less expensive long term, although it sounds like it's because they won't have to hire a lawyer to do a deed.
So I want to get back to Senator Brock, your question about this definition. That's why I went to the
Right.
title real quick, because I wanted to pull up this specific language. So permanently cited is used in 2 instances in the chapter. So a mobile home that is or is intended to be permanently cited shall be financed as residential real estate if the owner owns the land where the house is going.
Right.
Okay, so kind of two conditions have to be met there. It's if you own the land where the mobile home is going and it's going to be permanently sited, then the bank has to finance it as a real estate transaction, as with a mortgage. Okay. Then the second piece here, the two, is if you lease the land where the home is going and it's going to be permanently sited, it may be financed as a real estate. And that's the distinction, Madam Chair, you were just referring to. You had some parties come in and say, keep this distinction because it gives the banks the flexibility if the person doesn't own the land to finance it as a mortgage or to finance it as a personal property loan. They
And for the
want that,
buyer.
they want that some flexibility.
Right. And for the buyer who may not be able to afford a lawyer.
Well, we're not talking about the bill of sale right now or the deed, just how it's going to be financed.
Right.
Right? If it's going to be financed as real estate with a mortgage, it has to be transferred via a deed.
Right. Exactly. And so we had discussion about that.
Right.
And so keeping this option is important.
Right. The Chris Delias of the world will come in and say,
He's done.
please keep the sub two. Allow our members to finance them as a personal property if certain conditions are met, if it makes sense to do so. And so Senator Brock, back to your question, the permanently sited is relevant when you want to get that mortgage. Just right. And so what the House General Committee wanted to do was there was some concern about, do all of these conditions have to be met? So for example, you may still have the wheels on the house, but it's connected to utilities, you have a skirting on it. And so in
It's got
that
a concrete
event,
pad, it's belted down.
in that event, are you, is a bank requiring that every single one of these things be met? And the House General Committee felt that one or more of them could be indicative of it being permanently sited, and they wanted to clarify that.
But just as a matter of fact, how mobile homes are done in a mobile home park, they virtually all have one or more of these things.
Yes, sir.
Right. That
And
needs
they're
to,
obviously not
Yes, sir.
intended to be there permanently.
And that's where,
Most of them
that's
are
where I
different.
get into the distinction
Yeah.
with people, which is, yes, many of them don't move once they have been cited. But at the end of the day, your kind of statutory framework, as I mentioned earlier, is set up on the understanding or on the basis of the fact that it can move. And so then the question just becomes, going back to the language we were just looking at, you have this kind of dual flexibility where it's really dependent on where the property's going and is it going to be permanently affixed when it gets there. And then at that point in time, at that stage, the bank is determining, okay, it's going to be permanently fixed where it goes. And you own the land, now we have to finance it as real estate.
Right.
Even though you may move it later, if it's going to be permanently affixed when it gets to the location that it's
or
going.
it stayed there.
No, they can't. At that point, if it's moving, let's say you have something, a mobile home that you purchased at a deal. You take it to a mobile home park and install it in the mobile home park.
Yes.
At that point, whether it has a skirt around it or not seems to be determined of whether or not it's classified as real estate or as a bill of sale type item. It could be either at that point.
And either could be moved.
It is a factor that is considered, yes, sir.
Right.
And so if, let's say, it is placed at that location and it's treated as personal property as opposed to real estate. And then 2 years later, it's picked up, moved to another location and set up the same way.
Right.
And this time, you decided, well, you want to do it as real estate because the mortgage is cheaper for the rent. And so you do it as real estate.
Right.
And then you pick it up a third time and move it someplace else.
Right.
It can revert back either way. Is that right?
So this is a key thing to understand how the current statutory framework is, and then how the House General Committee was making some proposals which ultimately were removed. Currently, when you purchase the home, if it's being financed as real estate, it has to be transferred via a deed.
Even though it's not going to go to a place that has, probably will have one or more.
Of the permanently, kind of meeting it. Correct. It's just,
Sure.
it's how it's being financed. And so let's just take the scenario you were outlining a second ago. I'm purchasing the home from a dealer.
Mhm.
And it's going into a mobile home park.
Mhm.
So I don't own the land that it's going on.
Right.
I'm leasing that lot rent, right? If I can't find a bank that's willing to finance it as a mortgage, because they're not obligated to, going back to the statutory section we were just looking at. If it's on leased land, then it may be financed as real estate. So if I can find a bank that's gonna give me a mortgage for it, then the dealer has to transfer it to me via deed. And then I have a deed, then we're good. If I can only find a bank that's gonna finance it via personal property, and I'm putting in this mobile home park, then it gets transferred to me via a bill of sale because it's a piece of personal property, right? Then I'm going to sell it 5 years later. And the person's going to move it to a new town, or they're going to move it to their location where they own the property. And it's going to be permanently sited there. Well, now the bank has to finance it as real estate if it's going to be permanently sited on land that you own. So I'm selling it to somebody, but I have a bill of sale. Okay. I have to convert that bill of sale to a deed because you're financing it as a mortgage. The statute says if it's going to be financed as real estate, it has to be transferred via a deed. But I don't have a deed, I have a bill of sale. There is a statutory section, it's further down here, which talks about how you convert the bill of sale. This is in 2605, how you convert the bill of sale to a deed. And so one thing the House General Committee looked at was they wanted to allow more flexibility because there was some concern. Once you transfer it, once you convert it to a deed, it can't go back to a bill of sale. And there
Can't
was,
go back to personal property. It has to remain real.
it has to continue to be transferred via deed. You can't
Right.
write up a bill of sale afterwards. And so then there was also some concern about the conversion process itself. And then there was also concern, as you were mentioning, Madam Chair, you were kind of alluding to the concern of individuals having to go through the deed process. Typically
Right.
involves an attorney having to write it up, as opposed to a bill of sale, which is a little more, I would say, flexible in its language. And so there was some language in House General that was basically saying whether it's been financed as a real estate, whether it's been transferred via deed in the past, doesn't matter. You can transfer it via bill of sale, even if it's been transferred via a deed previously. The House Ways and Means Committee was not supportive of that language, and so they removed it. I think the argument being there's kind of been a trajectory or a history of the statutory language moving in the direction of treating manufactured homes as real estate.
Right.
As you mentioned, Madam Chair, you'll hear testimony from others saying, how, I don't want to quote them, so I haven't heard it directly, but, a small amount or a small percentage of these homes are actually
Almost none of them.
removed once they're actually set in place. So then let's treat them as real property. Let's stop treating them as personal property. And so you have the statutory language here that basically says, currently exists, if it's ever treated as real property, it has to be given a deed.
That to
And
continue
then
to
it
be.
can't go backwards to a bill of sale. It needs to be transferred via deed from that point.
But this
forward.
gives purchasers, so this just gives purchasers of manufactured housing options.
This bill, this bill doesn't make any changes to the current system that exists, which is it allows people to finance them via personal property.
Right.
It says it has to be financed via a mortgage if the person owns the land and it's going to be permanently sited. But it also says that once it's been converted to a deed or transferred
has to
via
stay there.
deed, it has to stay that way. There was some testimony in House General from people who were saying that banks require them to initially deed them to themselves in order to transfer it take the bill of sale, deed it to themselves in order to then transfer the deed because the conversion process is somewhat cumbersome. That may or may not be the case. I'm not here to say that, banks are wrong in what they're doing. I'm here to tell you there is a conversion process in the statutory framework that allows you to take a bill of sale and convert it to a deed.
Right. What about the situations in which you transferred this to a deed and you pick it up and you move the mobile home, which still has its wheels on it, to New Hampshire? What happens then?
Then you would have to go by what New Hampshire law is as far as.
To be able in other states, for example, to take a deed on something that traditionally is not deeded. I don't know if it's not deeded anywhere else, certainly. But I suspect that that's the case.
Yeah, the process of property ownership and transfer of property is, pretty much exclusively a state law matter. And so it would be whatever New Hampshire's law is in regards to how you go about reporting that instrument.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the fact that there are many mobile homes that are mobile and do in fact move state lines as people move and transfer. This is particularly true years ago and also like today for military. We get reassigned and their home goes with. But
Actually, the testimony is that it's not very many people then tend to.
we don't have very many military people in Vermont in
That are
comparison to
maybe already
the states
right.
that have large numbers.
Well, we're
And
just,
I'm just really just trying to get to answer the question. Is there a process by which a person who's got a deed in Vermont for mobile home can move with it?
In Vermont, yes.
Yeah, but outside of Vermont. In other words, what's going to happen to that person who has a mortgage on a movable asset that they want to take out of state?
And that's where I think you would have some of the banks coming in and saying that's why they want that flexibility regarding permanently sited. You could have a bank saying, hey, you don't own the land. It may be permanently sited, but you don't own the land. So we aren't willing to give you a mortgage because of the higher risk associated.
Well,
with
maybe
the fact
higher
that you
risk if the
include.
bank decides, but I'm just looking at only one of these conditions applies. And those are conditions that traditionally exist in movable mobile homes, such as skirting. Mobile home parks typically require skirting, but it doesn't mean that the home is there with any degree of permanence whatsoever.
And what I would say is the banks currently, they're not obligated to finance it as a mortgage unless you own the land. And so in that instance, yes, you could potentially move the home, like there's a risk there, but the bank would still they would be able to foreclose on the land itself if
Yeah.
you were to default.
No,
on the-
let's
That's the
put-
opposite that I'm concerned about. For example, does this provision limit someone from moving his mobile home?
No,
I don't think so.
Because the bank has a deed on it here in Vermont, and they move to a state that doesn't recognize deeds.
Let's get an answer to that
Mobile
question.
homes. That's
That's
what
a
I'm
very
really trying to
specific question. So let's get an answer to that question. About the out-of-state sale.
so I can't answer the question. It's
Yeah.
going to depend on what the other states' laws are.
Right.
You have a home, you have it deeded to you because you finance it as real estate.
So you
And now I'm wanting to take that home and I'm wanting to move it to another state. Or I'm taking it to another state to sell to someone else. Does that state recognize the deed that was executed in Vermont? It's gonna depend on that
So we
state's
have to
law.
recognize the deed.
Well, would they? What says that?
I don't know how we answer that, and I don't know, but we can.
Well, I'm wondering just what kind, I'm trying to determine what kind of exposure do we have of people who make a deal like this in Vermont and they want to move their mobile home?
So can we investigate that? We can also ask Chris Delia in.
So first, may be able to get some picture. This isn't an state issue as much as it is in-state issue.
Yeah, I don't think what I would say is the changes here, there's nothing that is in this bill that's going to significantly alter current practice.
Right.
That exists. I don't see anything that is.
Current
going-
practice in Vermont.
Yes,
Right, but we
Right.
need to answer the out-of-state question. But nothing,
My point is that mobile homes move across state lines. And I'm
they
wondering,
can, but
They
very
can.
rare.
well, I don't think it's
Yeah,
very
but
rare.
The whole scenario is very rare.
Yeah.
What they say, 3% of all homes are mortgaged. We're talking about a very, very small subset, even smaller subset that go across the
So
border.
let's find the,
But they have to be We have to understand what, looking for.
Let's find the answer to that.
We need to find an answer.
Right.
And that may be bringing Chris Deal in is a first step. But
Yeah.
it's a legal question
But-
as much as it is real.
But Pam is also gonna look at what we do out of state. So it's a good question. So
Yeah,
the same
we'll follow
thing, with personal property, we have, you could take your car and become a resident of another state and you just have to register it there. So the question is,
But they don't have two processes, one being a property tax and one being a personal property. Personal tax. but-
well, each state is different. So anyway, let's keep moving. Let's put a pin on this and answer the out of state question, please.
Okay,
So high level.
so again, high
So that
level,
takes us through the first whole section to page. Sorry, you keep going.
yeah, so again, the first thing I said, it was 6 pages, 5.5 pages are making some very minor technical changes to the process of when you sell a mobile home in the state and how it has to be financed. So for example, page 3, this is where it says that this section is, if you're financing it as real estate, it has to be transferred via deed. Sub C, we're just clarifying that this section is related to a warranty deed. Sub D is related to a quitclaim deed. And so this is the form that it, can follow. Technical amendment on 9, changing wife and husband to spouse. So again, very, very kind of minor stuff here. When you get to section 2 on page 6, we start talking about limited equity cooperatives. And so what we've had, a limited equity cooperative is a type of corporation. In title 11, chapter 14, you have cooperative housing organizations. These are organizations that you can create, you file them with the Secretary of State, and it is a form of collective house ownership. Right. And so within that subset, you have things that are called limited equity cooperatives. And these are corporate housing corporations, cooperative housing corporations that are designed for individuals of low and moderate income. And that is defined in the chapter as low, I believe is 80% AMI. Middle is, I believe it's 100 and maybe 120% AMI. 120. But these are corporate structures designed to serve individuals of low and moderate income. Now,
Who owns the units that are in these?
and typically, it is the corporation that owns it, and you, as a member of the corporation, have a proprietary lease to live in the unit.
The unit itself, not the property, it's
Yes,
the actual.
and so one thing to keep in mind with these is they're limited equity cooperatives. Not all limited equity cooperatives are a mobile home park. It could be an apartment building.
Condominiums, I mean, aren't these
Could be.
condominium associations too?
I wouldn't think about it in the sense of every condo association is a cooperative housing organization. These are not common interest communities.
Yes, these are,
Right.
okay, key to remember.
Right. This is a corporation owns the housing, could be a mobile home park, could be an apartment building. And the members of that corporation typically have a proprietary lease to live in one of the units. But the corporation owns the housing itself. In some mobile home parks that are registered as a limited equity cooperative,
Right.
the individual owns the mobile home. But the corporation
the land.
owns the land.
Right.
And they pay in their proprietary lease, it covers their lot rent essentially. So a whole lot of different possible scenario types that could exist under this umbrella here.
And so what do we do I mean, these exist, what do we do to further enhance or improve the life of people living in these?
Well, so what this bill does, when you get to, it's gonna be page 8. It says, for a mobile home park that is organized as a limited equity cooperative, the articles of incorporation shall prohibit the subleasing of the units unless a member demonstrates a hardship, in which case the board of directors may by an affirmative vote, grant an exemption. And the unit has to be subleased by an individual of low or moderate income. And then they have to require that a unit owner cannot sublease a unit for a higher amount than necessary to cover the cost of the unit, including costs of the monthly payment provided in the proprietary lease, cost of the mortgage, cost of utilities, etc. What is all this here for? Okay,
This is to guarantee that an affordable housing opportunity remain an affordable housing opportunity.
I think that's probably the best way to articulate it. But to get into a little bit of the detail here, so you have a cooperative housing corporation. The members have a share in that corporation. The corporation has to give them a proprietary lease that gives them the right to live in one of the units. And then they pay a set amount that the corporation has determined that they charge to live there. As I mentioned, the limited equity cooperative model is for people of low and moderate income. And so the section currently says in sub-7 that the articles for a limited equity cooperative shall require that no sublease shall provide for monthly payments by the subleasee in excess of 110% of the monthly payments for the unit provided in the proprietary lease. That means that if we're all living in a limited equity cooperative apartment complex, we'll use that as a scenario, and it's a 5-unit apartment, it has to be designed so that our monthly proprietary lease costs are available to us as low and moderate income individuals, right? So it could be $1,000 a month that you pay. That's your proprietary lease. If I'm going to sublease that apartment to someone else, I can only charge them 110% of that monthly payment.
So $1,100, you could only charge them $1,100, let's say. So the design is to keep it affordable, because as we heard testimony from, I think, Britt Donnelly, you don't want to these affordable housing units then being sublet at a substantial.
The point is it's supposed to
benefit
be
to them.
designed for low and moderate income people. So you don't want them turning around and charging other people being able to make money off that. But then the issue that the House General Committee was trying to address, my understanding anyway, is this is difficult in the scenario where, let's take the same people here, we all live in a limited equity cooperative mobile home park where you own your own home, but the corporation owns the park, right? So now I have a mortgage on my home potentially, or at least have a personal property loan on my home, and I'm paying the lot rent to the corporation who owns the property, but I own the home. So now I'm limited because let's say my proprietary lease costs, which covers the lot rent, let's say it's only a few $100s a month. This section would limit my ability to sublease for greater than 110% of that lot rent,
That's because you
which
own.
may not cover
Right.
my mortgage costs. It may
Got it.
not cover my overall personal property loan on the home. That's the issue that they were trying to address.
This is the issue they're trying to solve.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. And so that's why you get into this page 8, which says, A, you can't sublease the unit unless there's a hardship. Why are you putting that limitation on them? The committee felt that these are designed for the members of the corporation, and therefore, they should only be subleasing those units under limited circumstance. So they put in there that you can't sublease unless there's a hardship, in which case the board of directors can grant you an exemption. If you get that exemption, you can only sublease it for basically the cost that unit is to you. So that's where you get including the monthly payment for the unit, cost of any mortgage, cost of any utilities, capping the amount you can sublease it for to simply cover your costs. Have to take
Got it.
questions.
David, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I got a question. So, limited equity cooperatives. So the members have shares. Are you required as a member of a limited equity cooperation? Is it required that you're low income or moderate income to get in, be a member?
Yes, sir. It is.
Every one of the state, no matter whether it's an apartment or a mobile home park.
For the limited equity cooperatives, let me get to the statutory language. And the also. Share. Okay. So this is the section in Title 11 that governs a limited equity cooperative that says a cooperative housing corporation may organize as a limited equity cooperative in order to fulfill the public purpose of providing and preserving housing for persons and households of low and moderate income at the time that they purchase their membership. In addition to safeguarding the foregoing public purpose, a limited equity cooperative shall meet the following requirements. The articles of incorporation shall require that cooperative interests be sold at not more than a transfer value determined to maintain long-term affordability of cooperative interests for persons or households of low and moderate income. And so
it's really all designed.
and then it's defined, the low and moderate income has the definition of 80% or 100% of a month.
Second question, as you alluded to, if in this limited equity cooperative, the lease, you have an owner of a unit, but he's leasing the land. That's possible, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, but to have that mobile home stationed into or moved to a limited equity cooperative, they have to be low income or moderate.
Yes, sir. To be able to, so when you're thinking about these cooperative housing structures in the mobile home park scenario, in some instances, the corporation owns all of the mobile homes themselves. And
Look at that. Specifically about where the mobile home, the asset itself is owned by
yes, sir.
Okay.
It can
not
be
the
owned.
cooperative, but by the individual.
Yes, sir.
The cooperative owns the land underneath.
Correct.
And any
In which case the proprietary lease should be covering your lot rents, which should ultimately be covering whatever cost to the corporation to maintain the overall property itself, pay taxes.
the sewer, the water, the roads, the common or pool or whatever you have in common.
Correct. So that is,
So that's that section. That is that's the subleasing restraint.
so it is addressing only limited equity cooperatives that are mobile home parks, prohibiting subleasing. And then capping what the sublease for. And then you have this B1, which is a mobile home park organized as a limited equity cooperative shall be treated for the purposes of state funding and grants as if it were incorporated as a nonprofit corporation for a public purpose and public benefit. What are you trying to solve here? This was the issue that was raised by one of your witnesses a few weeks ago. At one point in time, certain mobile home parks that were being organized as limited equity cooperatives were being registered with the Secretary of State's office as nonprofit entities. And then at a point in time, the Secretary of State's office stopped doing that. Because just because you are a limited equity cooperative doesn't automatically mean that you should be treated as a nonprofit. And it is a separate corporate organization type. And so the advocates will come in and say, if our limited equity cooperative wants to go after certain state funding and grants, if we're registered as a nonprofit, then most times it's easier for us to access that funding capital. They look at us, they see that we're registered as a nonprofit, we can access those funds. If we're not registered as a nonprofit, then it becomes sometimes difficult. They have to jump through additional hoops to potentially access those dollars. And so what they're trying to address with this section is just to state that all mobile home parks that are limited equity cooperatives should be treated as if they are nonprofits. They are organized in the statute similar to a nonprofit. What do I mean by that? When you go again to the limited equity cooperative language, it says that it is in order to fulfill a public purpose
Right.
of providing and preserving housing for individuals of low and
Low
moderate
income,
income.
right.
And
But
then
what-
later on down, there is a limitation on what the limited equity cooperative can do with the property if it ever dissolves. So you know that nonprofits, if they dissolve, they have to, there's a limitation on what they can do with their assets. They typically have to transfer them to other nonprofit entities, okay? Similarly, there's this subdivision 6 here, which says that if a limited equity cooperative dissolves, after the corporation pays off its debts and distributes the members back their membership shares, then any assets that remain have to be transferred to a nonprofit or another limited equity cooperative. So you're capping and limiting what the cooperative can do, similar to what you do in the nonprofit world. So they are somewhat treated like a nonprofit in statute, but they don't automatically get a
Yeah, the
nonprofit
benefit of being a
designation.
nonprofit, right?
And so what that language is designed to do is to basically say in statute
For purposes.
that we should be treating them as a nonprofit entity. One thing I will point out to you is this is limited to mobile home parks that are organized as limited equity cooperatives. I'm not sure why the committee wanted that distinction, because in theory, a limited equity cooperative, whether it's a mobile home park or not,
Serving low
are
income
the same
people.
thing. Right.
So I would entertain actually a thought that we could expand this to include. Well, I mean, I don't know how many limited equity corporations there are that are not mobile home parks, but I assume there
Secretary of
must be.
State question. That's a question for the Secretary of State. I
So
don't
now we
know.
have David Hall back, so we need to get David Hall to come back and talk to us. about it.
And you may want, I think David was doing a great job in the House General Committee of explaining to them, why some of these are registered as nonprofits, some of them may not be, and what the distinctions, why there are certain distinctions between the entities with the Secretary of State's office.
Okay,
Okay.
and let's try to finish up.
Yep, as we finish up, should be able to do this quickly. Page 9, municipal zoning. This has a similar amendment to what you had in S 328. So this is about ensuring that you can build mobile homes or manufactured homes in districts that allow year-round residential development. So I'm not going to walk through that in detail. Then you get to the remainder of the bill. Page
It doesn't
10, 11,
undermine any of
12.
the zoning or ordinances.
And then you get the 10, 11, 12. This is about sales and use tax. And so this is to expand the sales and use tax exemptions for mobile homes to try to get the sales and use tax exemption and how much an individual would pay in sales and use tax on the purchase of a mobile home to be roughly equivalent to what the property transfer tax would be. When it was initially coming out of House General wanted to treat the purchase of every mobile home, manufactured home under the property transfer tax. And the Ways and Means Committee said, wait a minute, you're wanting to treat them as if it's real property by putting them under property transfer tax, but you've made all of these changes to make it easier to transfer them via bill of sale. Those two things don't align in the Ways and Means Committee's eyes. So that's why they removed all of that language to allow you to go back and forth between transferring via deed versus bill of sale. They kept the current statutory framework that exists as it does now. And they took away treating them under the property transfer tax. And they said, if you're going to purchase it via a bill of sale, we're going to keep treating you under the sales and use tax, but we will give you a higher exemption to try to make it on par with the property transfer tax as far as how much you would pay. These are John Gray's sections. Yep. So if you want more detail, would probably have to defer.
So this is trying to not lose any benefit by the change of this opportunity.
So whether a manufactured home is subject to property transfer tax or subject to sales and use tax depends on how it's financed. Is
Right.
it being transferred via the deed and being financed as mortgage? Or is it being financed as personal property? The sales and use tax exemption that you currently get for purchasing a manufactured home equates to the individual paying a different tax amount depending on whether it's property transfer or sales and use.
So, sorry, sales and use is only applied if you buy it as personal property.
Correct. And what this amendment is intended to do is to expand on the sales and use tax exemption to make it such that if you're buying it via a personal property loan and you're paying sales and use tax, the tax that you ultimately pay is going to be more in line with had it been treated as property transfer tax, and to try to make the tax amount that you have more equivalent.
So they're trying to achieve some kind of parity between the sale as personal property and or the sale as real property.
Yes, ma'am. Whether it's subject to property transfer, whether it's subject to sales and use, the individual who's purchasing it would ultimately be paying the equivalent amount regardless of which category they're having to pay into. That is the goal of that amendment. And to do that, you increase the exemption that's subject to sales and use tax. Or I guess you increase the exemption that would not be subject to sales and use tax, thereby making the tax amount lower. That's what those last few sections are intended to do.
Okay. Slowly.
And then the last piece, my apologies here on the line, or excuse me, the bottom of page 11, top of page 12 is conforming revisions. This gives our office the direction and the authority to go in and change in statute where it refers to mobile home and change it to manufactured home. So it would be in line with the federal definition for these housing types moving forward.
And that would be that's confirming that in section 8.
Yes, ma'am.
But the Secretary of State business registration, aren't they currently required to register with them?
So as I mentioned, and this is really a question that you need to ask David Hall as to why the Secretary of State's office did this and why they changed practice. Again, at one point, they were registering these manufactured home park limited equity cooperatives as nonprofit organizations. At one point, they stopped doing that.
Right, okay, goes back to the
And
nonprofit.
what this section does is it says that if a limited equity cooperative organization goes to the Secretary of State and asks the Secretary of State to update its business organization status within the Secretary of State's system, that the Secretary of State would do that. I don't know why an organization that's listed as a nonprofit would go to the Secretary of State and say, hey, don't list us as a nonprofit, because they get value by being
Right.
a nonprofit, arguably. But that statutory section would allow them to do so if they so choose to do so.
Okay, and that's it, I think, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
That's one question.
Yeah, sure.
Section 8, this line 19 and 20 on page 11. So the whole bill starts out by clearly defining what mobile homes are. This section said all mobile homes, their name is now replaced with manufactured homes.
Right, exactly.
But manufactured homes is one of 3 subsets. It's either mobile, prefabricated, or modular. So what's this? Why do we need section 8?
So I haven't been able to find an actual definition of manufactured home. or modular. So this question has come up in this committee and others about, ensuring that when you're referring to these things, what are we referring to? When you talk about offsite construction, modular, panelized, etc. I'm not aware of any definition in statute for any of these terms, including manufactured home. At the federal level, a manufactured home is a home that's built on a chassis that meets certain dimension requirements, is what you would kind of historically refer to as a mobile home. And the House General Committee wants to go away from calling them mobile homes and to call them manufactured homes so that they are in line with how the federal government refers
Right,
to
this
them.
is a HUD, yeah.
And so if you're asking, well, throughout the bill, we're referring to it as mobile home, why are we not making changes? We felt that it would be best to keep it listed as a mobile home in the statute, and then we will go in and make all of the necessary revisions at one point in time.
In the technical corrections bill,
Potentially, or through stat rev or something like that.
right?
It would be difficult if either A, if I went in and changed every reference in mobile home in this chapter throughout, this becomes a 100-page bill, give or take. Or if we're only making the changes where the words appear on the page as it currently exists in the sections that we're amending, then you're going to have some reference to mobile, some reference to manufacturer, and that may be confusing and problematic. So the statutory authority would allow us to do it all at once. Senator, I don't know that I'm answering your specific question. The House General Committee wanted to call them manufactured homes to align with the federal government. There isn't a definition of manufactured home currently in statute, but I do think this is something that you all would potentially want to take a look at and address if you're moving forward and referencing these things: manufactured, modular, panelized, offsite construction. They don't have any sort of definition in the statute currently. So in this, you would, for these, you would basically define mobile home as manufactured home moving forward. And so you all would then need to be careful because, obviously you could define the same things differently in different statutory sections if you want. But I would posit that if you make this change, if this bill becomes law, then a manufactured home in Vermont moving forward would probably be what you would historically consider as a mobile home.
Right.
And we would probably need to ensure that that is how
And
we're
but
phrasing that.
This is important for a bunch of HUD related reasons, as I recall.
I wouldn't say it's necessary. It's a state
Yeah.
question of whether you want to continue calling them mobile home or whether you
Okay.
want to align
So-
with the feds and call them manufactured.
Just because we're over time. The pieces in this bill we need to land still are the out of state question about a deed. And what else do people feel they have to land further?
I mean, it probably would be useful to make this conform to federal law.
Yeah, no, I agree. So we will take,
Manufactured home.
so let's get some testimony on the out of state deed, what happens with the deed as it goes out of state. I assume there's somebody who can give us an answer on that. And we'll try and land that and then see if we can get this out.
And whether you want to hear from David Hall or not.
Yeah, we have to hear from David Hall, we have to hear from Chris Delia, and anyone else, anybody has a brainstorm on in terms of out of state sales. Thank you very much. We'll go offline. See you tomorrow.